Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.
Hello and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. It honestly feels like we just sat down last week to record this episode to me, or last week's episode to me even, where we finally had the whole gang back together. But this week we're back down to a party of two with just me and Francis. So Francis, thanks for joining us once again. How have you been and how's the week been?
It's been a very, very cold week this week, and not to sound like a broken record and talk about the weather again, because I feel like that's what we always do, but it does officially feel like winter is really here now. I remember, I think it was a month ago, we were saying it feels like summer has ended, or no, it was probably September, maybe at the end of the start of October. But it now, especially, it really does feel like we're in winter has come, as they say in Game of Thrones. Winter has come. Anyways, but it has been a very, very busy week, which is probably why it feels like just yesterday that we did the last podcast, because I do agree it has absolutely flown by. But I'm doing very well and looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today.
Absolutely. I think we've got some good stories bringing to the table today. And with that, what is it you are talking about?
So what I wanted to talk about today is the latest campaign to put a dent in fraud by making consumers more aware of the risks during the Christmas holiday spending season.
Fantastic. And I'm going to be talking about two new studies that caught my eye, which both highlight the rapid rise of deepfakes in the last year. But why don't we get stuck into your article first?
Sure thing. So, yeah, my article today, it feels very sort of time appropriate, given that we are at the end of November, going into December, and it's really the sort of prime time for holiday spending. And I feel like when we talk about fraud, a lot of people always think, right, oh, I'm never going to fall victim to that. I've grown up with technology and I know how fraudsters work, that classic, if you don't know a number, don't pick up and don't give your details online. Don't open an email which has a weird actual email address from it, even if it says the person's name. All those things, everyone always thinks, oh, it would never be me, I'm too smart for that. And as a result, many consumers sort of believe they would not fall victim to classical fraud attempts. But criminals are becoming more sophisticated. And looking at the US specifically, 75% of shoppers will encounter scams when looking to buy things online. So in an attempt to ensure consumers do not fall victim, the Financial Technology Association is launching its annual campaign, Smarter Than Scams. And the National Education Campaign, in partnership with paytech giants Cash App, PayPal and Venmo, aims to empower consumers with the tools to outsmart scams. It looks to ensure users are keeping their money and financial information safe, as well as bringing awareness to the most common scams that they may face during the holiday season. For example, gift card imposters, invoicing, sort of phishing scams and romance scams, all those different types. And it outlines key ways in which consumers can consumers can protect themselves. So the first thing it says is that you can protect your personal information by safeguarding your login details, using different passwords across accounts, and keeping any sign-in codes or magic links private. It also says you should be aware of account activity by ensuring your account notifications, such as two-factor authentication and alerts for new device logins, are turned on. Pause before you pay by only sending money to people you know and trust, and verifying and double-checking all recipient information. Now, to me, those three things seem very simple, but at the same time, I think it's very, very easy from a consumer's standpoint to sort of, again, as I mentioned earlier, think, I'm not going to fall victim. This won't happen to me. And because of that, you sort of forget to do those things. So, in your opinion, is there sort of, do one of these three major points stick out to you above the rest? But how easy is it for people to think that they're immune to fraud and ignore these steps but end up paying the price?
I think these steps are very important. Like you said, a lot of them can seem very almost straightforward, like, you read them and think, well, I would always do that. But when you're just, especially during the busy Christmas season, you're trying to quickly buy gifts, you see a deal online, you think, I'll try and grab that before it goes out of stock, or you see something pop up on, say, the Facebook Marketplace, and you think, let me try and grab that before someone else does, and you're not quite so tuned into, oh, this could be a scam. You're just thinking, oh, this looks like a good deal, especially when there's a busy Christmas period. You're trying to buy gifts for people, whatever the case may be. I think it's very easy to just jump into something and not really think about the potential consequences. So I think the sort of always having in your mind, like, pause before you pay is very important. Making sure you're thinking about who you're sending money to, you're checking these details. And I think they're all obviously very important, protecting your personal information as well, being aware of your account activity is all important. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most in this kind of situation was the fact that it is in partnership with Cash App, PayPal, and Venmo. And they're obviously three huge organizations that really sort of dominate the payment space, especially in America. And you think people use it, can be a bit of a foreign concept to us in the UK, but Cash App's such a huge part of people's daily lives in the US. And the fact they're getting involved, the fact they're really trying to push the sort of education aspect of avoiding scams, I think that's really important. And yeah, I think it's just a really good kind of initiative to, as we're always talking about, the importance of education and making people aware of the types of scams that do exist. And I think another thing we always say is, because we're in the sort of world of fintech, we're always hearing about them. But for other people, this isn't something that they're not talking about scams on a regular basis. And sometimes there are always new types of scams becoming sort of prevalent and successful, and it's those ones that can catch people out because they're just not aware of those types of scams that exist. And I think it's very important that these education kind of initiatives are constantly being pushed, especially by these big organizations, because we always say, like, it's kind of a governmental area, they should be pushing this kind of thing, they should be teaching it in schools. But obviously the majority of people aren't in education, and they're using these platforms on a daily basis, and for these platforms to be pushing these points is a huge thing, I think. And I think that's really important for firms just to keep doing that and keep pushing these education aspects, because otherwise I think people do just kind of forget about it. They do think, if I haven't heard of a scam or I haven't been scammed in a long time, like you said, they're often thinking they're not going to be the ones that are caught out and they're too smart for it. But I think it's good to remind everyone, even us, that it's very possible to get burnt on whatever the platform it is, whoever you're sending money to, wherever you're making a purchase. That's something to always keep in mind. And I think, that's why I think this is a really good initiative, and I hopefully we see more of this, not only in the US but in Europe as well.
Yeah, just on your topic of sort of constant education and stuff, it got me thinking, sort of, what initiatives have we seen, or incentives as well, have we seen be really effective when sort of companies want to educate or get a new point across? And what I was thinking, especially sort of as you said, in partnership with sort of Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal, like, is there a way that, for example, if a consumer is putting in a new payee's details, and the pay text says, can you just spend 20 to 30 seconds? And 20 to 30 seconds is a long time when you sort of think about just sort of staring at a screen without anything happening. But if they say to you, give 20 to 30 seconds just to check through these details, and if you do, you'll sort of get 1% cash back on whatever you've spent. And that's just a way to sort of say, well, you can do one of two things, is either put the phone down and just do something else for 20 to 30 seconds for that 1% cash back, or you could actually just, that would be the way people get around it. But I feel like if people say you're at the pub or something and you want to send someone some money instantly, you're not going to wait 20 to 30 seconds. You're just going to say, oh, you skip this. I don't need that 1% cash back. But then obviously you run the risk. And I suppose in a way that would sort of say to people, look, if you want to get some money back, then just take the time to really look and make sure that the details are correct. But if you're in a rush, or that it's the right person, or you're that confident, which you should never be if you're buying online, but say you're with a friend or something and you want to put in their details that way, then that's a way to do it. But I just think that there's got to be some ways that people can be encouraged to, because having a pop-up when you want to send money, it's so easy just to disregard it and not actually bother reading it. But I think if there was actually a reward for educating yourself, I feel like people might take it on board more. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, to be fair. it could be a very expensive way for these platforms to actually try and prevent fraud. So I can see why that might not necessarily become a reality. But yeah, I do think incentivizing this kind of aspect of making sure you're protecting yourself is actually quite an interesting concept. Whether it would actually become a thing, I'm not too sure. But yeah, I agree. It's something that
it's all in theory. It's all in theory. I'm not saying it would be cost effective or beneficial, but in theory, if there was some way that consumers could be rewarded for without it sort of crippling a company's profit margins, but I think it would just be an interesting way to ensure, because I'm sure customers would tell their friends about it. They'd say, look, if you or it would be a way to ensure loyalty. If you just check your details and make sure you're sending it to the right person, this banking provider or this financial services provider, they're rewarding you for it. I feel like that could only end well, but again, it is all in theory. But yeah, it was just an idea as one way to sort of complement the Smarter Than Scams campaign.
No, I do think it's a good idea, and I mean, I hate to say it, but I think I'd be one of those people that's like, okay, every time I make a purchase, I'll put my phone down for 30 seconds, walk off, do something else, come back. Yeah, I've just saved 1% of my purchase. But I do think there's definitely something in incentivizing that aspect of, be extra careful. And if there is a way that they can do that, I think that would be a great thing. And obviously incentives are probably the most successful way to push people to do things. When you think about, even just adopting a new type of bank account, if the incentive's good enough to switch to the account, that's what gets people to do it. It's not the new features. It's for, I'm going to have an extra 50 quid in my bank account or $50 or whatever the case may be. Is incentives are always the way forward, and it's just whether these firms are willing to put their money where their mouth is, I guess.
No, exactly. But yeah, is always the case on the podcast. We'll have to wait and see how effective it really is. If consumers are a bit smarter with potential scams this year, we'll probably have to wait and see in January. But yeah, with that, why don't we go over to your article?
Yeah, of course. So making the move from these scammers, I guess, into fraudsters, because as I said, I'm going to be talking about the rise of deepfakes in the last year. And basically this came from the fact that Entrust Cybersecurity Institute released the 6th edition of its identity fraud report, in which it revealed that attacks involving deepfakes happened every 5 minutes in 2024, while digital document forgeries increased by 244% compared to 2023, and a staggering 1,600% increase since 2021. Now, these stats suggest that it's the first time that digital forgery has surpassed physical counterfeits, with digital attacks accounting for 57% of all document fraud. A lot of this is because fraudsters are abusing financial firms through AI-assisted deepfakes. Now, hyper-realistic AI-generated deepfakes and synthetic identities are increasingly enabling fraudsters to bypass biometric defensive measures. Now, as a result of these techniques by fraudsters, traditional banks have experienced a 13% increase from last year in fraudulent onboarding attempts, and they're just obviously the ones that they're catching and recognizing. And another one of the reports that caught my eye is the 4th annual identity fraud report by verification platform SumSub, which found a 121% year-on-year increase in identity fraud in 2024 across specifically the Asia Pacific region. And it also says that deepfake fraud saw a 194% year-on-year spike in Asia Pacific and increased 4 times globally, meaning that deepfakes now make up 7% of all fraud attempts in 2024, behind only fake documents, chargebacks, and account takeovers. Now, the reason I sort of brought this to the table is just this kind of clear idea that deepfakes are rapidly rising. They are becoming more and more prevalent in every region of the world. We've seen reports from North and South America, from Europe, and now Asia Pacific. This is something that's spanning the entire globe. And as firms are becoming more and more digital, and digital onboarding becomes, sort of the standard, deepfakes are seemingly becoming the number one way that fraudsters are, fraudulently gaining access to certain platforms. And I think, as I said, it's about 7% now, which puts it in sort of the 4th most used sort of fraud attempt. And the way it's rising, I expect it to see it becoming at least in the next year, one of the top 3 sort of ways that fraudsters try and, enable fraud. And I think with this, the reason I wanted to bring it to the table really is just, does this surprise you? Is this something that, are you surprised at how quickly deepfakes are becoming so hugely prevalent amongst fraudsters? And just ask really, can you think of any way that these firms can combat this, or should we just get used to the fact that deepfakes are just going to keep growing and growing and growing, and there isn't really any foolproof way to try and stop it?
I think, well, in answer to the first part of your question, no, it doesn't surprise me at all, because when a new technology emerges, the first ones that are going to try and test it, because they've got absolutely nothing to lose, are fraudsters. So the emergence of AI really benefited sort of the cyber criminals of the world, because while organizations were trying to stay within regulations and trying to figure out new ways to sort of implement this technology without it compromising other aspects of their business, fraudsters and scammers and cyber criminals, they're willing to test out any new sort of technology, because, as I said, they've got absolutely nothing to lose. Either it works or it doesn't work. And if it works, then brilliant for them, because they get to get access to data and information and money or whatever it is they're trying to sort of hack into or obtain. And if it doesn't work, it's no skin off their back, because they'll just try the next technology that comes along. So the only solution really that I can think of is firms need to be willing to adopt new technology, not just because of the competitive nature of, or getting a competitive edge, I should say, over their competitors, which is obviously another benefit of adopting technology. But I think if they don't, they're at risk of putting their consumers at risk. And ultimately, that's a surefire way for a company to shut up shop very quickly. Interestingly, I think it was in the Entrust Cybersecurity Institute report that you mentioned, it speaks about the most targeted industries in 2024. And it speaks about how cryptocurrencies were the most targeted. And that doesn't really come as a surprise at all to me, considering there's this whole thing about anonymity with crypto and sort of blockchain, and that it sounds like the perfect way. And because there's not as much regulation in the crypto industry as there is in other aspects of the financial world, I think it makes it so much a much easier entry point, I should say, for cyber criminals to really try and abuse technology and find ways to obtain information, money, and data that they can sort of utilize in a fraudulent way. And again, because of the nature of cryptocurrency, it sort of ties in perfectly to what they want to do, which is never be found out. So I don't think there is a simple solution other than sort of use technology themselves from a firm's point of view. I don't think there is a nice, easy sort of just say, oh, it doesn't apply to me. This issue is for other people to worry about, because now that the technology is here, it's here to stay. As soon as fraudsters have even an inkling that something is going to work, they're going to start to work on that a lot. And I imagine that now that they've seen that generative AI and deepfakes work, that's not going to suddenly stop for whatever reason. They're just going to continue to do that. So yeah, unfortunately, it's here to stay. And the only way that I can think that organizations can really combat it is by probably partnering with cybersecurity firms that are exploring the technology themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you made a good point, or an interesting point, that fraudsters don't really have to hang around, because, these traditional financial institutions are sort of bound by, we have to keep out of regulations, we have to stay compliant. And then you have all these different fraudsters that are just like, we don't have to hang around for anything. Fraudsters obviously aren't regulated, so they can just jump in, try different things, try different techniques, and really exploit that period where these financial firms are trying to build their defenses and keep out of complying with the different regulations. And it always leaves that gap for fraudsters. And I think that's why we constantly see fraudsters always being successful, and all they have to do really is pivot their technique in which to try and enact fraud. And another part of the sort of I think it was the report, which highlighted that it's actually more affordable than ever now for fraudsters to execute large scale operations with minimal investment. because anyone can access the resources needed to launch fraudulent schemes, sort of regardless of their technical expertise. You don't have to be this kind of mastermind, sort of stereotypical hacker that you see in movies. They writing a million lines of code in minutes. This is sort of fraud as a service that's appearing online now. And there are widely available fraud tools that anyone can access online, which provide a range of services to facilitate cybercrime, identity theft, account takeovers, financial fraud, you name it. There's a fraud as a service kind of aspect tool available out there somewhere if people are willing to look for them. And I think that's kind of the scariest part, is that literally anyone now is able to gain the tools to become a fraudster and try and enact fraud themselves. And I think that's another reason why it's just so difficult for financial firms to keep up, because how are you going to keep up with the fact that literally anyone can be a fraudster? You're not looking for people with, huge backgrounds in computer science or coding or whatever the case may be. It's actually, you're just looking for anyone who has access to these fraudulent tools. And I think that's why it's so difficult for these firms to keep up. And it's one of the reasons why the likes of deepfakes are actually rising so quickly, is because as long as you have a computer, that you're able to essentially have a go at it and try that type of fraud. And while the majority of people still wouldn't, there's still a huge amount of people that obviously would and are trying these techniques. And I think that's why it's a very interesting future, to see how these firms are going to try and really just stay alive with all these huge amount of fraud that's continuing. But with that, I think we've wrapped those topics up very nicely. And as always, if you want to hear any more news or insights that the Fintech Times receive, we're always publishing new content at thefintechtimes.com. And with that, we'll move on to our final topic, which is what I learned this week. So every week, so much more news and insight crosses our desks, and we like to pick something a little extra to share with our listeners. So Francis, kick us off. What have you learned this week?
So this week I learned that the global fintech Revolut has been granted a UK trading license by the FCA, making the fintech an authorised investment firm with its new, well, not its new trading feature, but it isn't reliant on a third party anymore. It has officially achieved its trading license.
Fantastic news. And I read that 1 in 3 UK subscription holders spot unfamiliar charges on their bank accounts, while Londoners are 120% more likely to notice unfamiliar subscription charges. And that's according to a new report from B2C prepaid payments platform Recharge. And with that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. So thank you very much for joining me this week, Francis, and hopefully I'll see you next week.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode and continue the conversation using #TFT News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.